It's July 24th, 1943. The world is at war and Italy is crumbling. Benito Mussolini, the dictator who ruled for 2 decades, is cornered. His armies in Russia and Africa are shattered. Allied forces have bombed Rome, seized Sicily, and are closing in. Famine grips the country. The people are restless. His enemies circle like vultures. Mussolini refuses to step down. Instead, he summons Italy's fascist leaders to his palace in Rome. Tension fills the air. Armed guards sweat in the summer heat. The meeting drags into the night. Mussolini rages, threatens his rivals, defends his rule, but the decision is no longer his. Just past midnight, a vote is held. One by one, officials scribble their verdict. The results are read aloud. Silence. Then, the weight of history crashes down. Mussolini is out. The next day, military police place him under arrest. His fate seems sealed: prison, exile, or perhaps death, unless someone rescues him, someone like Adolf Hitler. Welcome to Veil. Here, we pull back the curtain on history's most daring covert operations. The missions that changed wars, toppled regimes, and rewrote history. Mussolini's fall is a disaster for Hitler. It's the summer of 1943. And the Axis war machine is breaking apart. The Soviets are pushing back in the east. The Americans are crushing Japan in the Pacific. Now, Italy, one of Germany's last allies, is about to switch sides. Hitler has no time to waste. On July 26th, he calls an emergency meeting at his heavily guarded headquarters in Poland, the Wolf's Lair. Nazi commanders shuffle into the dark, swamp-surrounded bunker. They don't know why they're here, but they know their leader, and when Hitler is angry, men disappear. The room is silent as he delivers the news. Mussolini is gone. His generals exchange uneasy glances, but then Hitler unveils his plan, and it leaves them stunned. He wants to rescue Mussolini, overthrow the Italian government, and seize Rome. The idea is reckless and verging on impossible. His army chief warns him, Germany doesn't have enough troops near Rome to strike. They need time. Hitler agrees to delay the coup, but there's one thing he won't wait for: Mussolini's rescue. If the Italians hand him over to the Americans, it's over. The thought of a Nazi dictator, tried as a war criminal, is simply unthinkable. The mission must begin immediately. Hitler names it Operation Eiche. The Luftwaffe is given the most critical role. Germany's elite pilots and paratroopers are already training in southern France. Their commander, General Kurt Student, will lead the mission. But first, they need intelligence. Mussolini's location is still unknown. For that, Hitler needs a man he can trust. A man who won't ask questions. A man willing to do anything. He doesn't know it yet, but that man is Otto Skorzeny. At that moment, Skorzeny is drinking in a Berlin bar. Tall, stocky, and fanatically loyal, he was once just another Nazi mechanic. He dreamed of flying but spent the war fixing tanks. His arrogance got him noticed. His loyalty got him promoted, and now, despite no real combat experience, he leads an SS unit. His true talent? Keeping secrets. That's all Hitler needs. A phone call interrupts his drink. His secretary's voice is urgent. He is to report to the Wolf's Lair immediately. A plane is waiting. Skorzeny bolts from the bar. Excitement floods his veins. He doesn't know what awaits him. Meeting Hitler could mean a major assignment, or something far worse. The Gestapo had eyes everywhere. A single misstep, a wrong word in the wrong ear, and even the most loyal officers could vanish. But there was no time to dwell. He had orders. He rushed to the airport, still in civilian clothes. No time to pack. On the tarmac, he threw on his SS uniform and boarded a transport plane. He was the only passenger. The 2-hour flight felt longer. Alone, anxious, he sipped cognac, wondering what awaited him. The plane touched down near Wolf's Lair, Hitler's secret headquarters deep in a Polish forest. A black Mercedes was waiting. The ride through the dense trees was silent, broken only by the hum of the engine. Guards at the gate barely glanced inside. Skorzeny had arrived. Inside a dimly lit hut, 5 SS officers sat in tense silence. No introductions, no small talk. Then, a lieutenant appeared. It's time. The SS men followed him into the meeting room. Hitler was waiting. His piercing gaze swept across them, measuring, calculating. Then he asked a simple question. What do you think of Italy? The officers answered cautiously, praising Italy as a valuable ally. Skorzeny, the lowest ranking among them, spoke last. He took a risk. "I am Austrian," he said. A subtle reminder. Austria lost the land to Italy after World War I. Hitler never forgot that humiliation. Skorzeny's words hit their mark. The Führer nodded. Then he dismissed the others. Only Skorzeny remained. Hitler leaned in. Mussolini had been betrayed. He was in prison. The new Italian government was negotiating with the Allies. They might hand Mussolini over any day. That could not happen. Hitler's order is clear. Find him, rescue him, no matter the cost. Skorzeny saluted and left the room. He had just been chosen for one of the most daring missions of the war, but there was one problem. He wasn't a spy. Skorzeny moved fast. By the end of July, he and a team of 36 disguised SS officers landed in Rome, working under Luftwaffe Commander General Kurt Student. Their cover was thin. Nearly 40 SS men suddenly appearing in the city would draw suspicion. And there was another problem. No one knew where Mussolini was. Skorzeny had an idea. A nearby Nazi-run concentration camp produced counterfeit currency. He seized a stash of forged money and sent his men into the streets, bribing for information. It backfired. Locals gladly took the cash, trading rumors, lies, and wild speculation. In 1 week, the SS team burned through their funds and found nothing. Frustrated, General Student sent in reinforcements, 2 seasoned operatives. Kappler, a ruthless Gestapo spy, and Dolman, a smooth-talking diplomat. Kappler squeezed Roman police contacts. Dolman worked high society circles. They asked questions carefully. If Italy's new government realized the Nazis were hunting Mussolini, they'd move him, or worse. Then came a breakthrough. A Luftwaffe engineer spotted a heavily guarded convoy near Gaeta, a port on Italy's western coast. The next day, a German naval officer reported seeing Mussolini on a ship. Skorzeny had his first real lead. Mussolini was being moved, but to where? The SS team was drowning in contradictory reports. Ventotene, Elba, Santo Stefano, the dictator was everywhere and nowhere. Then, once again, the German Navy delivered the answer. A naval officer on Maddalena Island let slip that its only available car was reserved for Il Duce. Mussolini had to be there. Hitler demanded constant updates. Skorzeny had nothing concrete to report. His reputation and his life were on the line. He needed proof. On August 18, 1943, Skorzeny boarded a Heinkel bomber at an airfield outside Rome. His mission? Fly over Maddalena, take reconnaissance photos, confirm Mussolini's location. At 15,000 feet, he gripped his handheld camera, scanning the island below. But just as he prepared to take pictures, the plane lurched violently. A sharp crack echoed through the fuselage as the left engine failed. The bomber nosedived toward the sea, while the pilot fought desperately for control. It was too low for a parachute jump, leaving no choice but to attempt a crash landing. The impact was brutal, the cockpit crumpling on impact as water rushed in. Skorzeny and the pilot scrambled into a life raft, paddling with all their might to reach a nearby reef. Dazed and bruised, with 3 ribs broken, they struggled to stay afloat. Then an Italian naval cruiser appeared on the horizon. The very sailors he was spying on pulled him from the wreckage. But his crash near Mussolini's prison confirmed Italy's worst fears. The Germans were hunting their former ally. Prime Minister Pietro Badoglio didn't wait for proof. He ordered Mussolini moved immediately. They locked him away in a secluded ski resort perched atop Gran Sasso, one of Italy's highest and most unforgiving peaks. Hundreds of soldiers were stationed there with one simple instruction. If a rescue seemed imminent, Mussolini was to be executed. The alliance between Germany and Italy was collapsing. Mussolini's new location wouldn't stay hidden for long. In Rome, Gestapo spies Herbert Kappler had wiretaps installed across the city. It wasn't long before he intercepted a key conversation, a police inspector confirming security measures at Gran Sasso. The details were suspicious. Why was a ski resort heavily guarded in August? Kappler sent an agent to Isergi, a small village at the mountain's base. There, he uncovered another clue. The hotel's entire civilian staff had been dismissed without explanation. It was clear, Mussolini was there. With this new intelligence, General Kurt Student arrived in Italy. If Mussolini was within reach, Student would oversee the operation himself. Skorzeny wasn't pleased. This was his mission. but student dismissed him, focusing instead on a strange report. Days earlier, a Red Cross seaplane had landed near an Italian military base. It was escorted by an armed ambulance and a convoy of vehicles. No one knew why. Student was convinced it had been Mussolini. Skorzeny wasn't so sure. He had little to show for himself so far, and now his role was shrinking. Reluctantly, he agreed to bring their findings to Hitler. Back at Wolf's lair, Hitler listened carefully. Then he laughed. Mussolini's prison was a luxury ski resort, amusing, but also an opportunity. This wasn't a fortified military complex, it was an isolated hotel. The raid should be simple. Skorzeny could lead it. Hitler gave the order. Mussolini would be rescued. The Germans knew Mussolini's location, but had no idea how to reach it. Grand Sasso was a fortress in the sky. A single heavily guarded road wound up the mountain. A ground assault would be a disaster. Paratroopers were considered, but the risks were too great. Winds at that altitude could scatter them across the cliffs. Then came the solution: gliders. Major Harold Moors, a Luftwaffe paratrooper, was assigned to the mission. He was an expert in airborne warfare, known for his stealth and precision. His unit specialized in glider landings. Silent, sleek, and deadly, gliders needed only 60 feet to touch down. In 1940, Moore's men had launched a surprise attack on a fortified Belgian castle, capturing it before defenders could react. Now, they would land directly on the plateau. But there was one problem. They still had no clear images of the terrain. Skorzeny saw a chance to prove himself. Again, he would take to the skies. This time, he wouldn't rely on built-in cameras. He packed a handheld camera and boarded a Luftwaffe plane. At high altitude, the air was brutal, freezing at 18 degrees. With his assistant gripping his legs, Skorzeny hung out of the aircraft, snapping photos. His fingers went numb. His ribs, still broken from his last crash, throbbed with pain. But this time, he landed safely. Triumphant, he rushed to develop the photos. This would finally prove his worth. The results, however, were devastating. The images were useless. The hotel appeared as nothing more than a tiny gray speck, offering no discernible details about the surrounding terrain. Nothing the Germans didn't already know. Skorzeny had failed again. But there was no time to dwell on it, because at that very moment, Italy was preparing to betray Hitler. For weeks, Italy had been secretly negotiating an armistice with the Allies. The US wanted a full surrender. Italy wanted American troops to defend Rome from German retaliation. Neither side budged. Then, on September 8, 1943, US General Dwight Eisenhower lost patience. Italy's surrender was announced, without Italy's consent. The message spread across radio waves. Italy had betrayed Hitler. Hitler was furious. He wanted revenge. He ordered Rome invaded and Prime Minister Badoglio captured. Thousands of German troops flooded the city. Italian forces were alone, without backup or allies. Desperation gripped the nation as Badoglio, the royal family, and Italy's top generals vanished overnight. They knew what Hitler wanted, and they weren't waiting to find out what happened if he caught them. For 48 hours, Rome became a war zone. Hundreds of Italians died. Nazi losses stacked up, but in the end, Germany stood victorious. Still, Hitler wasn't satisfied. He had Rome, but the rest of Italy was slipping away, and Mussolini, the face of fascist Italy, was still missing. The Italians knew Germany was coming. Mussolini had to be moved. Again. If the SS was going to take him, they had to strike now. At a Luftwaffe base near Rome, Major Harold Moors had less than 16 hours to plan the impossible. The only way in was a glider assault. 12 gliders, 120 men, machine guns, and explosives. To get out, a ground convoy would seize the cable car station below, while the glider troops stormed the hotel. Mussolini would ride the cable car down, then be flown to Hitler. A flawless plan, if everything went right. By midnight, Moors was on edge. The gliders still hadn't arrived. The convoy had 100 kilometers to cover before dawn. If they were late, the gliders would land with no escape. At 2:30 a.m., Moors made the call. No more waiting. The men were shaken awake. It was now or never. At 3 a.m., the convoy rumbled out of the base. Motorcycles led the way. Trucks followed. Anti-tank cannons brought up the rear. The Italian countryside was silent, but Moors wasn't taking chances. His troops cut telephone lines along the route. No warnings, no alarms. Hours later, they reached the base of Gran Sasso, and that's when the first gunshots rang out. Italian resistance fighters opened fire from rooftops and alleyways. Bullets ripped through the streets. The Germans answered with machine guns. Grenades rained down. It was over fast. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Italians scattered. At the cable car station, the remaining guards surrendered without a fight. The Nazis now controlled the only escape route. But for Moores, this was just the beginning. He lifted his binoculars and peered up. The hotel loomed over the cliffs. Now it was up to the gliders. But back at the airfield, there was a new crisis. At 11 a.m., the first gliders touched down on the tarmac. The troops cheered until they counted, only 10. Moores and Skorzeny locked eyes. 2 were missing, 20 men short, no time to wait. The plan had to change on the fly. Major von Berlepsch, the man leading the airborne assault, quickly reassigned teams. Skorzeny fumed. He wanted control. He wanted glory. But for now, he kept his mouth shut. As troops loaded into the gliders, General Student stepped forward. Most had no idea what they were about to do. Then he told them. They were going to rescue Benito Mussolini. A cold silence filled the air. They all knew what this meant. If the raid failed, there would be no escape. 80% of them would die. But if they succeeded, they might turn the tide of the war. The men exchanged glances, some swallowing hard, others smirking at the odds. Then, disaster struck. The airfield's emergency alarm blared, signaling the presence of enemy aircraft. Skorzeny froze. This was it. If the bombs fell now, the entire mission would be over before it even began. He scanned the skies and waited. The Luftwaffe base, their launch point, was under attack. In the skies above, Allied bombers approached. General Student shouted orders, and soldiers scrambled for cover. The first explosions struck, shaking the ground. Smoke and fire erupted from the tarmac as bullets raked across the runways. For what felt like an eternity, the air was thick with chaos, until finally, silence descended. Students stepped out of the hangar, scanning the destruction. The runway was cratered, debris smoldering in the afternoon sun, but the gliders, miraculously, remained intact. There was no time to waste. The mission had to proceed immediately. Student ordered the men to load up. They were taking off now. While the Germans prepared to storm the mountain, Mussolini was preparing for death. On the evening of September 10th, he listened to the radio from his mountaintop prison. The words sent a chill down his spine. Italy had surrendered. As part of the agreement, he would be handed over to the Allies, facing a trial, the noose, and ultimately, public humiliation. Mussolini refused to let his enemies decide his fate. That night, he grabbed a razor and slashed his wrists. The guards heard his cry and burst into the room, seizing him before he could finish the job. Blood covered his arms, but his attempt had failed. From that moment on, his captors removed every sharp object and never left him alone. Mussolini believed his fate was sealed, but he had no idea that, at that very moment, a Nazi rescue team was closing in. The mission had been carefully planned by 3 men. General Kurt Student, a master of airborne operations. Major Harold Morse, a seasoned paratrooper known for flawless execution. And Otto Skorzeny, an overconfident S officer desperate for glory. Morse had spent weeks orchestrating the glider assault. Everything had been calculated to the second. Now, at 11 a.m. on September 12th, the gliders finally arrived. Weapons were loaded, final orders given. Then, Skorzeny saw his chance. According to Moore's plan, the most skilled paratroopers would land first to secure the area. Skorzeny wasn't part of that team. That wasn't acceptable. He had to be first. He approached General Student and suggested a change. His SS team should replace some of Moore's paratroopers. After all, Hitler trusted his loyalists. Student hesitated, so Skorzeny played his trump card. He had an Italian general, Fernando Soletti, in custody. If Soletti landed first, Mussolini's guards might hesitate. Seeing an Italian officer giving orders could convince them to surrender without a fight. Reluctantly, Student agreed. Skorzeny was now in the second glider, but he wasn't finished yet. At 1 p.m., the gliders took off, soaring toward Gran Sasso. The tension in the cockpit was suffocating. Skorzeny wasn't willing to wait. He ordered his pilot to take the lead. The pilot hesitated. This wasn't part of the plan. "I speak for Hitler," Skorzeny snapped. That was all it took. The pilot obeyed, and Skorzeny's glider broke formation, diving toward the mountain ahead of the others. Then came disaster. The reconnaissance photos had been wrong. This wasn't a flat plateau. It was a steep, rocky incline covered with jagged boulders. It was a death trap. The pilot turned to Skorzeny, his face pale. If they landed here, they would crash. The wreckage would block the landing site for every glider behind them. If they aborted now, the entire mission could fail. Skorzeny shouted at the pilot to stay on course. There was no turning back now. The glider plummeted toward the mountaintop, skimming just above the rocky terrain. Skorzeny peered through a hole in the canvas, barking last-minute directions. His men gripped their rifles, bracing for impact. The ground rushed toward them. 100 feet, 50, 20. Then, with a violent jolt, the glider slammed into the earth, skidding through rock and grass. It finally came to a halt just yards from the hotel. For a brief moment, all was still. Then, reality set in. They had lost the element of surprise. Skorzeny jumped out first, sprinting toward the building, too eager for glory to issue orders. Behind him, his SS men were disoriented, shaken by the hard landing. Some scrambled to clear the wreckage for the next wave of gliders. Others set up a machine gun, expecting immediate resistance. Italian guards rushed from the hotel, weapons raised. But before a single shot could be fired, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" It was General Soletti, the captured Italian officer Skorzeny had brought along. The sight of one of their own giving orders stunned the guards. They hesitated, their fingers resting on their triggers, unsure whether to fire or stand down. For once, one of Skorzeny's gambits had worked. While the general stalled the guards, Skorzeny ran to the back of the hotel, searching for an entrance. He flung open a door, only to find an Italian soldier sitting at a telephone switchboard. It was the wrong room. He quickly shut the door and pressed on, his frustration mounting. Then, above him, he noticed movement in a window. He looked up and saw a familiar face staring down at the commotion. It was Benito Mussolini. For a moment, Skorzeny froze, his heart pounding. There he was, the man they had risked everything to find. He called up to Mussolini, urging him to stay clear of the windows in case fighting broke out. But the battle never came. More gliders touched down on the plateau. Moore's elite paratroopers moved in with swift precision, securing the area. Unlike Skorzeny's SS troops, these men had trained for the mission. They locked down the hotel, neutralized the guards, and cut off escape routes. The Italians hesitated. Was it worth dying for a deposed dictator? In the end, the choice was clear. They surrendered without a fight. With the hotel secured, Skorzeny rushed up the stairs. At the second-floor landing, 2 Italian police officers stood guard. Flanked by paratroopers, Skorzeny ordered them aside. They did not resist. He stepped forward, reached for the handle, and opened the door. Inside, Mussolini stood waiting. Mussolini looked frail, pale, his beard unkempt. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty. He was a shadow of the powerful figure who once ruled Italy. For Skorzeny, it didn't matter. He had found his prize. Standing tall, he announced, "Deuce, the Führer has sent me to set you free." Mussolini nodded. "I knew my friend Adolf Hitler would not abandon me." Outside, the final gliders landed. Moore's men took full control of the area, cutting off the last pockets of resistance. The entire operation had lasted less than 10 minutes. Not a single shot had been fired. Now, they just had to get Mussolini off the mountain. As Skorzeny led Mussolini out of the hotel, German photographers rushed to capture the moment. The images would be plastered across Nazi propaganda, a symbol of the Axis still standing strong. The Italian dictator forced a smile for the cameras, but he looked exhausted. 6 weeks in captivity had drained him. He shook hands with his rescuers, thanking them for reaching him before the Allies could. Then he made one final request: spare the Italian guards. They had surrendered without resistance. Mussolini did not want his own countrymen executed. Skorzeny agreed, then hurried him toward the cable car station. But as they reached the entrance, Moores was waiting with bad news. The original escape plan was no longer an option. The plan had been to take Mussolini down the mountain by cable car, then board a waiting aircraft in the valley below. But there was a problem. The plane had landed unevenly, damaging its landing gear. It would take hours to repair. Moores didn't want to risk it. The Italian military could be on its way. Instead, a tiny reconnaissance plane was en route to land directly on the mountaintop. It was small, too small. When the aircraft finally arrived, Skorzeny's eyes widened. It was a light Fieseler Storch, a fragile, short takeoff plane. There was only room for 2 passengers and a pilot. Mussolini had 1 seat. Skorzeny was determined to take the other. The pilot refused. The plane had been designed for just 1 extra passenger. Adding another might prevent takeoff entirely. Skorzeny refused to listen. He insisted that Hitler would never allow Mussolini to fly without an escort. The pilot, reluctant but terrified of defying Hitler's orders, gave in. The SS men cleared rocks from a makeshift runway. Skorzeny squeezed into the cockpit beside Mussolini. The pilot revved the engine to maximum power as paratroopers held the plane in place. Then, on his signal, they let go. The tiny aircraft shot forward, bouncing wildly over the uneven slope. The edge of the mountain loomed closer. For a terrifying moment, the plane dropped off the cliff, plunging into a nosedive. Then, at the last second, the pilot pulled up. The wings bit into the air. They were flying. Cheers erupted from the ground below. As the mountain faded behind them, Skorzeny finally let out a breath. He had done it. He had Mussolini. And soon, he would present Italy's fallen dictator to Hitler himself. In his mind, he was already a legend. He imagined the praise, the medals, the moment he would stand before Hitler as the hero who had pulled off the impossible. What Skorzeny didn't realize was that his legacy would soon take a different turn. On the night of September 12, 1943, Mussolini and Skorzeny landed in Vienna. The dictator, exhausted from weeks in captivity, retired to his room immediately. Skorzeny, on the other hand, stayed awake, basking in his self-proclaimed glory. He celebrated with a pint of beer, replaying the mission in his mind, imagining his name in history books. Shortly after midnight, an SS colonel arrived at the hotel. Without ceremony, he placed the Knight's Cross medal around Skorzeny's neck. Hitler had personally awarded it and promoted him to major. Minutes later, the phone rang. It was Hitler himself. "You have carried out a mission that will go down in history," the Führer declared. For Skorzeny, this was the moment of his life. Just weeks earlier, he had been a mid-level SS officer, barely known outside Berlin. Now, he was Germany's rising star. The next day, Germany officially announced Mussolini's rescue. The news shook the world. By September 13th, headlines around the world hailed the operation as one of the most daring military raids of the war. It was exactly what the crumbling Axis war effort needed, a high-profile success. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, seized the moment. "There's hardly been a military event during the entire war that has so deeply stirred the emotions and evoked such human interest," he wrote. The Nazis carefully crafted the narrative. The true mastermind, Major Morse, was forgotten. The elite paratroopers who carried out the mission were ignored. Instead, Skorzeny became the face of the operation. It was a calculated decision. Hitler wanted the SS to appear invincible. A bold, charismatic figure like Skorzeny made for a perfect war hero, even if his reckless actions had nearly doomed the mission. For General Student and Major Morse, it was an insult. They had led the planning, executed the most difficult aspects of the operation, and ensured its success. Yet it was Skorzeny who became a Nazi celebrity. 2 days after his rescue, Mussolini arrived at Hitler's secret headquarters in present-day Poland. The Führer welcomed his old ally with open arms. But Mussolini wasn't the man Hitler remembered. Years of war, imprisonment, and political failure had left him weak and disillusioned. He no longer spoke of glory and conquest. He barely seemed interested in ruling at all. Still, Hitler had a plan. Mussolini would rebuild fascist Italy under German supervision. Nazi forces had captured several Italian officials who had deposed him, and Hitler encouraged Mussolini to execute them as traitors. At first, Mussolini refused, but Hitler gave him an ultimatum: retake power, or Germany would remove him permanently. By the end of 1943, Mussolini reluctantly established the Italian Social Republic, a puppet state under Nazi control. Pressured by Hitler, he agreed to a show trial for the officials who betrayed him. They were sentenced to death and executed by firing squad. But Mussolini's new government was doomed from the start. The Italian public wanted no part of Mussolini's return. Across the country, citizen militias and partisan fighters waged a brutal resistance against both fascist loyalists and Nazi occupiers. By 1944, Italy had descended into civil war. The Allies advanced from the south, while resistance forces sabotaged German troops from within. Mussolini, however, barely seemed to care. From his new home hundreds of miles from Rome, he lived in self-imposed exile. He spent his days reading, playing the violin, and writing philosophy. He was no longer a leader, just a figurehead under Hitler's control. By early 1945, the war was nearly over. The Axis was collapsing. Then, on April 24th, Mussolini received a final letter from Hitler. "The struggle for existence or non-existence has reached its climax," it read. Mussolini understood what it meant. On April 27, 1945, Mussolini fled northern Italy with his mistress, disguised as a German soldier. They made it as far as the small village of Dongo, where Italian communist partisans recognized him at a checkpoint. The next day, after a brief deliberation, Mussolini was executed by firing squad. His body was transported to Milan, hung upside down in a public square, and desecrated by furious citizens. 2 days later, Hitler committed suicide. The war in Europe was over. Otto Skorzeny, however, had no intention of facing the same fate. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, he was taken into Allied custody and imprisoned as a suspected war criminal. Yet, even in defeat, Skorzeny managed to maintain his image. American newspapers called him Germany's most dangerous man. Some even described him as rather handsome. In 1947, he faced a US military tribunal. Accused of war crimes, he was acquitted on all charges. But his troubles weren't over. He was scheduled for a second trial, this time for his ties to the Nazi Party. If convicted, he would spend years in prison, so he did what he did best. He escaped. On July 27, 1948, 3 former SS officers, disguised as American soldiers, walked into his detention camp. They flashed forged papers and convinced the guards that they were transferring Skorzeny for a court hearing. The Americans believed them. Skorzeny was escorted to a waiting car, driven out of the facility, and vanished into the night. In the years that followed, Skorzeny became a ghost. Rumors swirled that he helped former Nazis escape to Argentina and Egypt. Some claimed he worked with dictators like Franco and Perón. By the 1950s, he was rumored to be advising the Egyptian military on commando tactics. By the 1960s, he had settled in Spain, where he lived comfortably under Franco's rule. He died of cancer in 1975. But for all his post-war exploits, his greatest achievement remained Operation Eiche. Even Winston Churchill acknowledged it as a daring raid. Of course, it did nothing to change the course of the war. Fascism fell, the Allies prevailed, and history marched on.